Chapter 1. The Invitation to Harbury Hall. The December afternoon was drawing to its early close as the motor car turned through the stone gates of Harbury Hall. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her good traveling coat with a fur collar that her nephew Raymond had given her 3 Christmases past, peered through the window with interest. The great house stood at the end of a long avenue of elms, their bare branches etched black against a sky heavy with the promise of snow. "You'll find it very grand, I expect, miss," said the chauffeur, a young man with an unfortunate tendency to take corners too quickly. "Sir Reginald and Lady Amelia. They do know how to entertain at Christmas." "I'm sure they do," murmured Miss Marple, noting the well-kept grounds and the warmth of light already glowing from the many windows. "Though I confess I was rather surprised to receive the invitation. Lady Amelia and I met only once at the missionary tea in St. Mary, me last spring." The chauffeur made no reply to this, perhaps sensing that no reply was required. Miss Marple continued to observe. The house itself was Elizabethan, or perhaps Jacobean, with later additions that spoke of prosperity and taste. Ivy clung to the eastern wall, and even in winter the garden showed signs of careful tending. It was, she thought, the sort of house where things were done properly, where traditions were maintained, and where secrets might be kept very neatly indeed. The motor drew up before the entrance, and almost immediately the great oak door opened. A butler of magnificent bearing descended the steps to assist with her modest luggage. "Miss Marple, welcome to Harbury Hall. I am Bridges. Lady Amelia is in the drawing-room receiving guests before dinner." "How kind," said Miss Marple, allowing herself to be conducted inside. The entrance hall was festooned with holly and ivy, great swags of greenery that filled the air with a sharp, clean scent. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, its decorations catching the light from the fire that blazed in the enormous hearth. The house had that particular quality of warmth and preparation that spoke of money spent generously, but also, Miss Marple fancied, of something performed almost as a duty. There was welcome here, certainly, but perhaps not quite ease. Lady Amelia Harbury rose from her chair as Miss Marple was announced. She was a handsome woman in her middle 50s, perfectly dressed in dove-gray silk that brought out the silver in her dark hair. Her smile was gracious, her hands extended in greeting. "Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us. I do hope the journey wasn't too tiresome." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "The countryside is beautiful, even in winter, and the anticipation of a proper Christmas house party is always cheering." "We do try to maintain the old traditions," said Lady Amelia. Something flickered across her face as she spoke, gone so quickly that Miss Marple might have imagined it. "Let me introduce you to some of our guests." A stout gentleman with a military bearing bowed briefly. "Colonel Mortimer, retired from the Indian Army. Neighbor, don't you know? Come every Christmas for 30 years. 40, corrected a sharp-featured woman beside him. "I'm Mrs. Treadwell from the village. I keep the church flowers and assist Lady Amelia with the charity arrangements." Miss Marple exchanged pleasantries, noting the way Mrs. Treadwell's eyes darted about the room, missing nothing, approving little. Rather, she thought, like old Miss Hartnell at home, who always knew everyone's business, and was determined to think the worst of it. "And this," said Lady Amelia, her voice taking on a note that might have been pride, or might have been something else entirely, "is my daughter, Clara Ara." The girl who rose from the window seat was perhaps 23 or 24, fair-haired and pretty in the English manner. She had been crying, Miss Marple noted, though she had attempted to disguise it with powder. The girl's smile was strained. "How do you do, Miss Marple? I hope you'll enjoy your stay." "I'm quite certain I shall. said Miss Marple gently. The girl reminded her of young Patience Creed, who had wept so prettily when the curate had disappointed her at the church social. That had ended badly, as she recalled. The drawing-room door opened again, and a tall, dark-haired young man entered. He moved with easy confidence, though Miss Marple detected a certain watchfulness in his eyes as they swept the room. "Ah, Charles," said Lady Amelia. Her tone was noticeably cooler. "Miss Marple, may I present Mr. Charles Denham? He is engaged to my daughter." "Congratulations," said Miss Marple, studying the young man with interest. He was handsome in a theatrical sort of way, with features that would photograph well. His clothes were expensive, but slightly too fashionable, suggesting a man who cared greatly about appearances. "Thank you," said Charles Denham. He moved to stand beside Clara Ara, reaching for her hand. She pulled it away with a movement that tried to seem casual, but failed entirely. Before this small drama could develop further, a whirlwind in emerald green taffeta burst into the room. "Aunt Amelia, I'm so sorry I'm late. I was absolutely positive my train was at 3 o'clock, but it was at 2, and I only just caught it by abandoning all dignity and running like a housemaid with her skirt tucked up." The young woman was dark where Clara Ara was fair, vivid where Clara was pale. She embraced Lady Amelia enthusiastically and then turned to survey the room with bright, assessing eyes. "You must be Miss Marple. I'm Lydia Trent, the disreputable cousin from London. Aunt Amelia is terribly kind to keep inviting me, despite my shocking behavior." "Not at all shocking," said Lady Amelia quickly. "You're young, my dear. 26 is hardly young. Aunt Clara's younger than I am, and look how much more respectable she is." Lydia's gaze moved to Charles Denham. "Hello, Charles. How perfectly domestic you look." Miss Marple observed that Charles Denham had flushed slightly, and that Clara Ara had gone very pale indeed. The sound of the dinner gong resonated through the hall, and Bridges appeared in the doorway. "Sir Reginald asked that everyone should assemble," he announced. As the party moved toward the dining room, Miss Marple found herself walking beside Colonel Mortimer. "Always a good show. The Harbor Christmas," he remarked, "though things seem a bit strained this year." "What? Not quite the usual jolly atmosphere." "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple mildly. "Christmas brings families together, and that is not always entirely comfortable." "Ah, quite right, quite right. Too much intimacy, bad as too much port." Sir Reginald Harry greeted his guests at the dining-room entrance. He was a large man, fit and prosperous, with the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His welcome was hearty, but his eyes, Miss Marple noticed, were hard and calculating. When Charles Denham entered, Sir Reginald's expression did not alter, but his jaw tightened perceptibly. He did not speak to the young man at all. As Miss Marple took her seat, she reflected that it was going to be a most interesting Christmas indeed. The table was beautifully appointed, the food excellent, the conversation brittle. Through it all, Miss Marple listened, observed, and remembered. She had seen this pattern before in villages and drawing-rooms throughout England. Something was wrong at Harbury Hall, something that lay beneath the holly and the candles, and the forced good cheer. By the time the dessert was served, she was quite certain of one thing. This Christmas party had not been arranged for celebration. It had been arranged for reckoning. Chapter 2. Mistletoe and Music. The ballroom at Harbury Hall had been transformed into something approaching fairyland. Garlands of evergreen looped from the high ceiling, interspersed with white ribbons and clusters of red berries. Candles blazed in the great chandeliers, their light reflected in the polished floor and the tall mirrors that lined the walls. A string quartet occupied the corner dais, filling the air with a waltz that spoke of Vienna and elegance and times that perhaps had never existed quite as remembered. Miss Marple had positioned herself in a comfortable chair near the fireplace, in company with Mrs. Treadwell and an elderly lady named Mrs. Fortescue, who lived apparently in the Dare house and suffered from deafness that came and went according to the interest of the conversation. It was Miss Marple had long ago learned an excellent vantage point. From here one could observe without seeming to pry, listen without appearing to eavesdrop, and form conclusions while appearing merely to drowse. "A beautiful party," remarked Mrs. Treadwell, though her tone suggested she found it nothing of the sort. "Though I must say, in my younger days we knew better than to display quite so much gaiety when there were troubles beneath the surface." "Troubles?" inquired Miss Marple innocently, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. Mrs. Treadwell leaned closer, her voice dropping to that particular pitch that carries remarkably well. "The engagement, of course. Everyone knows Sir Reginald deposed it from the start. Mr. Denham has no family to speak of, no fortune, no prospects beyond what his looks might bring him. Sir Reginald told Colonel Mortimer only last week that he'd soon to see Clara Ara married to the butcher's boy." "How very unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple, "though I expect the young lady has her own feelings on the matter." "Young ladies always do," said Mrs. Treadwell darkly. "That's precisely the difficulty." The music swirled, and couples moved across the floor with varying degrees of grace. Clara Ara danced with her father, her face composed, but her eyes distant. Charles Denham stood near the punch table, apparently engaged in conversation with Lydia Trent. Even from across the room, Miss Marple could detect the intensity of their exchange, the way they leaned toward each other, the animation in Lydia's gestures. Lady Amelia appeared at Miss Marple's side, moving with the distracted air of a hostess, ensuring all guests were content. "I do hope you're comfortable, Miss Marple. Not too cold. The ballroom can be draughty, despite the fires." "Perfectly comfortable, thank you. It's a lovely party. The decorations are particularly charming." "The mistletoe was Sir Reginald's insistence," said Lady Amelia, and Miss Marple noted how her gaze traveled upward to where a large bunch of mistletoe hung from the ancient oak beam that crossed the center of the ballroom. "It's a harbor tradition. Every Christmas Eve for 300 years or so, the family claims. Rather pagan, I've always thought, but tradition is tradition." There was something in her voice, Miss Marple thought, that suggested Lady Amelia would have been quite happy to dispense with this particular tradition. She followed the older woman's gaze and observed that the mistletoe hung directly above the most frequented path across the ballroom floor. The waltz concluded, and the musicians struck up something more lively. Young people began to gather, laughing and breathless from the dance. Miss Marple watched as Clara Ara moved toward Charles, her expression hopeful, perhaps ready to forgive whatever small transgression had caused the earlier tension. But Charles was no longer at the punch table. He had moved toward the center of the room, and Lydia Trent was beside him. They were directly beneath the mistletoe. What happened next occurred with the horrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy, though Miss Marple suspected it had been considerably more orchestrated than fate alone could manage. Someone called out, "Look, mistletoe!" and laughter rippled through the younger guests. Lydia glanced upward, her expression one of delighted surprise that seemed to Miss Marple's experienced eye rather too perfectly timed. Charles Denham hesitated for just a moment. Then, with the air of a man who cannot refuse without appearing chish, he leaned forward and kissed Lydia Trent beneath the mistletoe bough. It was not a chase-steed Christmas party sort of kiss. It lasted several seconds too long, and when they drew apart, Lydia's face was flushed and triumphant. and Charles looked like a man who had forgotten where he was. The silence that followed was profound. Then came the gasps, the whispers, the rustle of silk as people turned to look at Clara Harbury. The girl stood frozen near the edge of the dance floor, one hand pressed to her throat. Her face had gone white, then red, then white again. For a terrible moment, Miss Marple thought she might faint. Instead, Clara turned and fled from the ballroom, her silver slippers making no sound on the polished wood. "Well," breathed Mrs. Treadwell with unmistakable satisfaction. "I did mention there were troubles." Miss Marple said nothing. Her attention was fixed not on the fleeing Clara, nor on Charles Denham, who stood looking stricken and foolish, nor even on Lydia Trent, who had arranged her features into an expression of innocent dismay. Miss Marple was watching Lady Amelia. The older woman had not gasped. She had not exclaimed or rushed after her daughter. She stood perfectly still beside one of the pillars, and on her face was an expression that Miss Marple recognized from long experience. It was not shock nor even anger. It was triumph. The moment passed. Lady Amelia's expression smoothed into appropriate maternal concern, and she hurried from the room, presumably to comfort Clara. Sir Reginald, red-faced and furious, bore down upon Charles Denham like a ship in full sail. The musicians, with the admirable instinct of professionals, struck up another waltz as though nothing whatsoever had occurred. But something had occurred, and Miss Marple, resuming her knitting with steady hands, considered its implications. She thought of Annie Triggs, the housemaid in St. Mary Me, who had been so very conveniently discovered in the arms of the gardener's boy by the lady of the house, just when the lady needed an excuse to dismiss the girl, who had witnessed something she ought not to have seen, and of young Mrs. Clement, who had arranged to be found in a compromising position because she desired to break her engagement, but lacked the courage to do so directly. Kisses beneath mistletoe could be innocent, spontaneous, meaningless, but they could also be planned, deliberate, and freighted with purpose. The question was, whose purpose had been served tonight? Colonel Mortimer appeared with a glass of champagne for Miss Marple, which he accepted with thanks. He settled into the chair Mrs. Treadwell had vacated. "Damned awkward business," he muttered. "Young fool should know better. Still can't entirely blame him. That Trent girl is a firecracker. Always has been. Not like poor Clara, who's gentle as a lamb." "Lambs," observed Miss Marple mildly, "are often led to slaughter." The colonel blinked at her, unsure whether she had made a joke or a prophecy. The evening wore on. Clara did not return to the ballroom. Lady Amelia reappeared after half an hour, her composure perfect, and moved among her guests with gracious determination. Charles Denham stood in a corner looking miserable, refusing all attempts at conversation. Lydia Trent danced every dance, her laughter perhaps a shade too bright, her color too high. And through it all, Miss Marple observed and remembered the way Sir Reginald avoided looking at his future son-in-law. The glances exchanged between the servants, the smell of hot house-flowers and candle wax, and something else, something faintly bitter beneath the sweetness, like almonds, concealed in marzipan. When the clock in the hall began to strike midnight, the company gathered for the traditional Christmas toast. Miss Marple noticed that Clara had returned, pale and composed, standing as far from Charles as the room would allow. The champagne was poured, the glasses raised, and Miss Marple settled back in her chair, certain now that this night's entertainment was far from over. Chapter 3. The kiss everyone saw. The hours between midnight and dawn on Christmas morning were traditionally meant for peace and goodwill. At Harbury Hall, they brought neither. Miss Marple, who had retired to her comfortable guest room overlooking the east garden, found sleep elusive. It was not the unfamiliarity of the bed, which was excellent, nor the cold, which was adequately addressed by a proper fire and sufficient blankets. It was rather the peculiar quality of the house itself, which seemed to hum with tension like a wire pulled too tight. She rose at 6, dressed carefully, and made her way downstairs. The servants were already about their business, and she encountered a housemaid carrying fresh linens along the corridor. "Good morning," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I'm afraid I'm an early riser." "I do hope I shouldn't be in anyone's way." The girl bobbed a curtsy. "Oh, no, miss. There's tea in the morning room for any guests as wanted. Through that door and to the left." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the morning room, where she found Colonel Mortimer already installed with the Times and a substantial breakfast. "Morning, Miss Marple. Trust you slept well. Dreadful business last night." "What? Young people today have no sense of propriety." "I wonder," said Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea from the sideboard, "whether young people ever had much sense of propriety, or whether we simply remember our own youth more kindly than it deserves." The colonel harumphed into his newspaper. The door opened, and Charles Denham entered. He looked as though he had not slept at all. His face was haggarded, his eyes shadowed, and his usual easy confidence had entirely deserted him. "Good morning," he said quietly, helping himself to coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Miss Marple studied him with interest. He had the look of a man who had made a terrible mistake and was only now beginning to comprehend its full consequences. She'd seen that expression before on the face of young Dr. Stone when he realized that his flirtation with the chemist's daughter had been observed by the entire village. "I need to speak with Clara Ara," Charles said abruptly, addressing the room at large. "I must explain. It wasn't what it seemed." "It never is," murmured Miss Marple. Charles turned to her, his expression desperate. "You understand, don't you? These things happen. One moment of foolishness, and suddenly everything is ruined." "The difficulty," said Miss Marple gently, "is that moments of foolishness are rarely as spontaneous as they appear. Someone usually arranges the circumstances." Charles stared at her. "What do you mean?" But before Miss Marple could reply, the door opened again, and Lydia Trent swept in, wearing a morning dress of deep crimson that did remarkable things for her complexion. She appeared extraordinarily well-rested and in excellent spirits. "Good morning, all. Isn't it a glorious Christmas day? I do so love snow, and it looks as though we shall have plenty of it." She moved to the window, her back to Charles. "I've just been speaking with Clara Ara. Poor darling. She's taking it all so very hard." Charles sat down his coffee cup with a sharp click. "Lydia, we need to talk." "Do we?" She turned, her expression innocently inquiring. "I should think we've talked quite enough, Charles. Or rather, we've been seen quite enough, which amounts to the same thing. That kiss meant nothing, really. How very lowering for me. And here, I thought it meant a great deal." Her eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement or malice or both. "But then, you've always been rather good at making people believe things mean nothing, haven't you?" Miss Marple, sipping her tea and appearing absorbed in the view of the snow-dusted gardens, filed this exchange away for future consideration. There was history here, clearly, and not the simple history of a flirtation at a Christmas party. The colonel, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor, folded his newspaper and departed. Charles and Lydia continued their conversation in lowered voices, but Miss Marple's hearing, when she chose to employ it, was excellent. "You planned this," Charles said. "You positioned us beneath that mistletoe deliberately." "Did I?" How terribly clever of me, though I seem to recall that you were quite willing to cooperate. I was trying to avoid a scene. Instead, you created one. Poor judgment, darling. Their voices were drawing closer now, and Miss Marple judged it prudent to make her presence more obviously known by rattling her teacup against its saucer. The two young people fell silent, though the air between them remained charged with unspoken accusations. The morning passed in a strained attempt at festive normality. Presents were exchanged in the drawing-room, though Clara Ara's gift to Charles remained unopened on the table, and Charles's gift to Clara was received with a stiff thank you, and no attempt to unwrap it. Lady Amelia presided over the proceedings with determined cheerfulness, while Sir Reginald said little and drank steadily from a flask he kept in his waist pocket. Miss Marple found herself seated beside Mrs. Fortescue, whose selective deafness had apparently lifted sufficiently to catch the essential gossip. "I always said that young man was unsuitable," the old lady announced in a carrying whisper. "Too handsome by half, and no proper family. Lady Amelia should never have permitted the engagement." "I had rather gathered," said Miss Marple, "that Lady Amelia was not entirely pleased about it." "Pleased, my dear. She was horrified. But Clara Ara can be surprisingly stubborn when she chooses. Takes after her father in that regard, though in little else. Sir Reginald was determined to break the engagement, but Clara Ara threatened to elope. A scandal either way, you see, Miss Marple did see. She was beginning to see quite clearly indeed. The day wore on toward evening, and the party gathered once more, this time for the Christmas Eve ball's continuation, though the atmosphere was decidedly less festive than the night before. Dinner was a subdued affair, and when the company moved to the drawing-room afterward, the conversation remained stilted and uncomfortable. At midnight, Sir Reginald rose and announced that they would observe the tradition of a Christmas toast. Champagne was brought, glasses distributed, and the company arranged itself in a loose circle near the fire. Miss Marple accepted her glass and noted its contents with interest. The champagne was excellent quality, and there appeared to be nothing unusual about it. Yet something troubled her. Some small detail that her mind had registered, but not yet brought to conscious attention. Clara stood as far from Charles as possible, her face composed, but her hands trembling slightly. Lydia lounged against the mantelpiece, looking like a cat that had discovered a particularly rich source of cream. Lady Amelia's expression was unreadable, while Sir Reginald's was all too clear. He looked at Charles Denham with undisguised loathing. The clock began to strike 12, its chimes resonating through the house. "To Christmas," said Sir Reginald, raising his glass, "and to the end of pretense." The toast was drunk. Charles Denham, standing nearest to the sideboard where the champagne had been poured, drained his glass in one long swallow, as though he needed the courage it might provide. Then he staggered. His glass fell from his hand, shattering on the hearth. He clutched at the mantelpiece, his face contorting, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Lydia screamed. Clara rushed forward, all grievances forgotten in the face of genuine crisis. Charles Denham collapsed to the floor, convulsed once, and lay still. The laughter that had filled Harbor Hall for 2 days stopped completely. In the terrible silence that followed, Miss Marple's mind was already working, cataloguing details, recording observations, noting the placement of glasses and people, and the curious expression on Lady Amelia's face. It was not the expression of a woman witnessing an unexpected tragedy. It was the expression of a woman watching a carefully laid plan come to fruition. Chapter 4. Champagne and Secrets. The scene that followed Charles Denham's collapse had about it the quality of a tableau vivant, where everyone remained frozen in their positions, as though awaiting the click of a camera shutter to release them into motion. It was Colonel Mortimer who moved first, dropping to his knees beside the fallen man with the instinctive efficiency of one who had seen death on battlefields far from England. He pressed his fingers to Charles's throat, held them there for a long moment, then looked up and shook his head. Clara Ara's scream pierced the silence. She would have thrown herself upon the body, but Lady Amelia caught her daughter's arm and held her firmly, murmuring words that might have been comfort or command. "Someone fetch Dr. Haddock," said Sir Reginald. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple observed that his face had gone grey, and his hand shook as he set down his champagne glass. "He's staying at the Dower House for the holiday. Bridges, go at once." The butler, who had been supervising the serving of the champagne from his position near the door, bowed and departed with admirable composure. The remaining servant stood uncertainly, awaiting instruction. Miss Marple, who had remained in her chair throughout, now rose and moved quietly toward the fireplace. Her knitting bag remained on her lap, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. While others clustered around the body, or comforted the hysterical Clara Ara, Miss Marple studied the scene with a methodical attention she might have given to a complex pattern of stitches. The shattered champagne glass lay on the hearth, its contents spilled across the stone. A few inches away, something else had fallen, something that caught the firelight with a dull gleam. Miss Marple bent down, her movements those of an elderly lady adjusting her shawl, and observed it closely without touching. It was a sprig of mistletoe, crushed and wilted, and on one of its white berries was a distinct smear of crimson. "Lipstick," thought Miss Marple. "How very interesting." She straightened and allowed her gaze to travel across the room. Lydia Trent stood pressed against the far wall, one hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with what appeared to be genuine shock. Her lips, Miss Marple noted, were painted a deep crimson. But then, so were Lady Amelia's, though of a slightly different shade, and Clara Ara, despite her distress, wore a pale rose color that had not quite survived her tears. "This is an outrage," Sir Reginald was saying, his voice rising, "an absolute outrage in my own house on Christmas Day. It cannot be borne." "What cannot be borne," said Mrs. Treadwell, who had been ominously silent until now, "is that a young man has died. The question is, how and why?" Dr. Haddock arrived within 20 minutes, a brisk, competent man in his 60s, who had attended half the county through births, deaths, and the various afflictions that lay between. He examined the body with professional thoroughness, while the company waited in strained silence. When he rose, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid," he said slowly, "that this was not a natural death. The symptoms are consistent with poisoning. I cannot be certain without a proper examination, but I believe we are looking at the introduction of a toxic substance, possibly strychnine or something similar." The gasps that greeted this announcement were followed by a babble of voices cut short by Sir Reginald's raised hand. "Poisoning in my house? It's impossible. There must be some mistake." "I wish there were," said Dr. Haddock, "but I've seen these signs before. The convulsions, the rapidity of onset, the manner of collapse, all point to deliberate poisoning. I'm afraid the police must be called on Christmas Day." Lady Amelia's voice was faint. "Murder," said Dr. Haddock grimly, "keeps no holidays." The police, in the form of Inspector Crane from the County Constabulary, arrived as the hall clock was striking 2. He was a solid, methodical man, who reminded Miss Marple somewhat of Inspector Slack from her own district, though with rather better manners. He took charge of the situation with quiet efficiency, directing that the body should be left undisturbed, and that all guests and servants should remain in the house until morning. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually," he announced. "For now, I must ask that no one leave the drawing room. Dr. Hawk, if you would assist me in examining the scene." While the inspector and doctor conferred in low voices, Miss Marple found herself once again in a position to observe. The company had arranged itself into natural groupings, as people do in times of crisis. Clara sat weeping quietly on a sofa, comforted by Mrs. Forskue. Lydia Trent had moved to the window and stood staring out at the snow, her profile sharp against the dark glass. Colonel Mortimer and Sir Reginald spoke together near the door, their voices too low to be overheard, but their gestures suggesting disagreement. Lady Amelia stood alone. Miss Marple rose and moved to her side as though by accident. "A terrible shock for you, Lady Amelia. May I fetch you some water, or perhaps some smelling salts?" "You're very kind, Miss Marple, but I require nothing." Lady Amelia's voice was steady, but her hands, Miss Marple noted, were clenched tightly in the folds of her dress. "I simply cannot comprehend it. In my own house, with my own guests, it's unthinkable." "Yes," murmured Miss Marple, "though I fear we must think about it none the less. Tell me, when was the champagne poured?" Lady Amelia blinked, as though surprised by the question. "Why, just before midnight. Bridges brought it in on a tray already poured. It's what we always do for the Christmas toast." "I see. And the glasses were all together on the tray?" "Yes, of course. We each took one as Bridges passed among us." Lady Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why, do you ask?" "Oh, merely curiosity," said Miss Marple vaguely. "Wonders wonder about these things. I noticed that Mr. Denham was standing nearest the sideboard. Had he been there long? I really couldn't say. I was attending to Clara, who was still upset about the previous evening's incident. Quite natural. And Miss Trent. Where was she standing?" Lady Amelia's expression grew decidedly cold. "I believe she was near the mantelpiece. She had positioned herself there deliberately, I think, to be as far from Clara as possible. Some sense of shame, perhaps, though rather belated." Miss Marple allowed this to pass without comment. She had moved slightly closer to the hearth now, and was studying the arrangement of furniture and people with care. Inspector Crane was examining the shattered glass, making notes in a small book. Dr. Haddock pointed out something on the floor, and the inspector bent to look more closely. When the inspector straightened, his expression was troubled. He approached Sir Reginald. "I must ask, Sir Reginald, who had access to the champagne before it was served?" "Access? Good God, man! It was in my wine cellar under lock and key. Bridges brought up 3 bottles this morning and placed them in the pantry. They weren't opened until just before midnight. And between the pantry and this room," Sir Reginald hesitated. "Well, I suppose anyone might have passed through the corridor, but to suggest that one of my guests—" "I suggest nothing yet," said Inspector Crane firmly. "I merely gather facts. Now I shall need to examine that glass more carefully, and I must ask you all to remain here while I conduct a thorough search of the premises." As the inspector moved away, Miss Marple approached the hearth once more. The crushed mistletoe still lay where it had fallen, and beside it, barely visible among the ashes, was something else. Miss Marple bent down with difficulty, her hand apparently seeking the arm of a chair for support. In the process, her fingers brushed the object and drew it slightly toward her. It was a small key tarnished with age and heat. Miss Marple straightened, the key now concealed in her palm. She returned to her chair, her face thoughtful. Around her, the company waited in miserable silence for whatever revelations the night might bring. The champagne glasses stood abandoned on various surfaces throughout the room. Miss Marple's trained eye noted that one glass, the one that had stood nearest to where Charles had been standing before he took his own from the tray, had been moved. It was no longer where Lady Amelia had left it. Chapter 5. The Maid's Eavesdrop. The grey light of Boxing Day morning found Miss Marple awake and dressed well before the household stirred. She had spent what remained of the night in thoughtful consideration of the evening's events and had come to certain conclusions that wanted testing. Inspector Crane had kept them until past 4 o'clock, conducting his interviews with methodical persistence. Each guest had been questioned about their movements, their relationship with the deceased, and their observations of the fatal toast. Miss Marple's own interview had been brief. She had stated truthfully that she'd been seated throughout, that she had taken her champagne from the tray when it was offered, and that she had observed Mr. Denham collapse shortly after drinking his own. What she had not mentioned was the mistletoe, the lipstick, or the small key that now resided in her knitting bag. There would be time enough for such revelations when she better understood their significance. The house was very quiet as she made her way downstairs. The servants would be about their duties, but the family and guests would likely sleep late after the horrors of the night. Miss Marple, however, had always believed that the early hours were the most fruitful for observation and inquiry. She found her way to the servants' hall, where a young maid was polishing silver with fierce concentration. The girl looked up, startled, as Miss Marple appeared in the doorway. "Oh, miss! He gave me such a fright. Can I fetch you something? Tea." "Perhaps that would be most kind," said Miss Marple, settling herself on a nearby chair, with the air of one who intended to stay. "And perhaps you might spare a moment to talk with me. I find myself quite unsettled after last night's dreadful events." The maid, who appeared to be about 19, set down her polishing cloth with evident relief. "It was terrible, wasn't it, miss? I'm Elsie, the upstairs maid. I've been that nervous. I can hardly hold the silver steady. I'm not surprised. Were you in the drawing-room when it happened?" "No, miss. I was clearing the ballroom from the night before. We'd left it, you see, after all the upset with Miss Clara Ara. But I heard the commotion, and Mrs. Bridges, she's the housekeeper. She told us all to stay in our quarters until the inspector said otherwise." Miss Marple accepted the tea that Elsie poured with slightly trembling hands. "The ballroom must have required considerable tidying. I imagine it was quite late when you finished." "Past midnight, miss. There was ever so much to do. What with the garlands dropping needles and the glasses everywhere. And the mistletoe, of course." "The mistletoe?" Elsie glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. "Well, miss, it's not my place to say, but there was quite a scene about the mistletoe earlier in the evening, before the party, I mean. I was bringing fresh linens to the guest rooms, and I heard Lady Amelia and Miss Trent having words in the gallery." Miss Marple's knitting needles began their steady click. "How distressing. I do hope it wasn't too heated. It was right fierce, miss, begging your pardon. Miss Trench, she was saying something about how Lady Amelia had no right to interfere, and that what happened under the mistletoe was nobody's business but hers." "And Lady Amelia?" she said. Elsie paused, clearly torn between discretion and the need to unburden herself. "Do go on, my dear. Sometimes it helps to speak of these things," she said. "You've ruined enough lives, Lydia. Don't ruin mine." That's what she said, Miss Clear as day. "And Miss Trent?" She laughed. But it wasn't a nice laugh, if you take my meaning. She said, "Your life was ruined long before I came along, Aunt. At least I have the courage to admit what I want." Miss Marple digested this in silence, her needles never faltering. And how did Lady Amelia respond? "That's the queer thing, miss. She didn't sound angry anymore. She sounded frightened. She said, 'If you go through with this, you'll destroy us all.'" And then she saw me passing in the corridor, and they both went silent as the grave. How very awkward for you. Tell me, Elsie, did you notice anything unusual about Lady Amelia's demeanor afterward? Elsie considered this carefully. She seemed quite determined about something, miss. Later, when I was turning down the beds, I saw her coming from Sinel's study with a ring of keys in her hand. The household keys, I think, what she keeps locked in her private sitting room. She looked well resolved, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple knew exactly what she meant. She had seen that expression on many faces over the years, the look of someone who had decided upon a course of action, however unpleasant it might be. And Miss Trent, how did she seem? Excited, miss. All aflutter like a girl going to her first dance. She kept humming to herself, and when I brought her hot water for washing, she was trying on different dresses, asking which one made her look most fetching. Elsie's expression showed what she thought of such vanity. Settled on the green one, finally, though it seemed a bit bold for a family party, if you ask me. The emerald green taffeta. No, miss. The other one, the silk gown with the low neck, dark green like ivy. She wore it to dinner. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. Lady Amelia had also worn green the previous evening, a gown of deep forest green that had looked remarkably elegant. Two women in similar colors, either by coincidence or design. You're very observant, Elsie. I expect nothing escapes your notice. The girl blushed. Mrs. Bridges says I'm too nosy by half. But I can't help noticing things like how Mr. Denham kept looking at Miss Trent during dinner, even when Miss Clara Ara was speaking to him, and how Sir Reginald's hands were shaking when he carved the roast, and how he had to take a nip from his flask before he could manage it properly. Sir Reginald was upset about the engagement, I understand. More than upset, miss. I heard him tell Mr. Bridges that he'd see Mr. Denham in hell before we'd see him married to Miss Clara. And that was before the business with the mistletoe. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Elsie, I wonder if I might ask you something rather particular. When you were clearing the ballroom last night, did you find anything unusual? Anything that seemed out of place? Elsie frowned. Well, there was ever so many glasses, miss, and napkins, and such. But now you mention it, I did find something odd. A little bottle. It was under one of the chairs near where the champagne had been laid out. Empty. It was with a queer smell about it. Like almond, sort of, but bitter. What did you do with it? I put it on the tray with the other oddmans. Miss, it'll be in the pantry now, I expect, waiting to be sorted. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. Thank you, Elsie. You've been most helpful. I wonder if you might show me where you put this tray? But before Elsie could respond, Mrs. Bridges appeared in the doorway, her expression severe. Elsie, you're wanted upstairs. Miss Clara Ara is asking for hot water and toast, and Miss Marple begging your pardon, but Inspector Crane wishes to speak with you in the library. Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and followed the housekeeper from the room. As she walked through the corridors of Harbury Hall, her mind was working rapidly, fitting pieces together like the intricate pattern she created with wool and needles. Fear, she thought, often hides behind the neatest smiles. Lady Amelia had been frightened, and frightened people were capable of extraordinary actions. The question was whether those actions included murder, or whether someone else had seized upon the opportunity that fear created. The little bottle with its scent of bitter almonds would tell her much if she could find it before it disappeared entirely. And the small key in her knitting bag, the key that had lain beside the crushed mistletoe on the hearth, might tell her even more. Chapter 6. A Locket on the Floor. Inspector Crane had established himself in the library with the thoroughness of a general claiming strategic territory. Papers were spread across Sri Reginald's mahogany desk, and a constable stood guard at the door, with an expression of determined vigilance that reminded Miss Marple of the young men who had guarded the vicarage during the war years. All dedication and very little discernment. "Miss Marple," said the inspector, rising as she entered. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please do sit down." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he indicated, arranging her knitting bag on her lap. "I'm happy to help in any way I can, Inspector, though I fear my observations are of little value. On the contrary, Dr. Haydock tells me you have a reputation in your own village for noticing things others miss. Something about a poisoning case some years ago." "The de Havilland affair," said Miss Marple modestly, though that was largely a matter of understanding human nature rather than detecting clues in the conventional sense. Inspector Crane leaned back in his chair. "And what does human nature tell you about this case? That it is rather more complicated than it first appears. But then these matters usually are." The inspector smiled faintly. "Indeed. Now, I've been examining the deceased effects, and I found something rather curious. Perhaps you might offer your perspective." He opened a small evidence bag and withdrew a gold locket on a delicate chain. With careful fingers, he opened it to reveal two miniature photographs set side by side. One showed Clara Ara Harbury in full bridal regalia, clearly taken for the engagement announcement. The other showed Lydia Trent in evening dress, her dark beauty striking even in the tiny portrait found in Mr. Denham's waistcoat pocket, said Inspector Crane. "Rather damning, wouldn't you say? A man carrying portraits of both his fiancée and the woman he kissed under the mistletoe." Miss Marple studied the locket with interest. "May I?" She took it carefully and examined both photographs, then the locket itself. The gold was worn at the edges, suggesting it had been handled frequently. The clasp was slightly loose, and when she tilted it to the light, she could see faint scratches on the back, as though it had been opened and closed many times. "Two women," murmured the inspector, both with reason to be angry with him, one might say, and he was engaged to one while apparently conducting a liaison with the other. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though I wonder whether Mr. Denham was quite the villain he's being painted. Tell me, Inspector, where exactly was this locket found?" "In his waistcoat pocket, as I said. His waistcoat pocket." "How very odd." Inspector Crane frowned. "Odd? How so?" "Well, if one carries a locket containing photographs of two women, both of whom are present at the same house party, one would surely take care to keep it well hidden. The waistcoat pocket seems rather careless, don't you think? Any valet helping a gentleman dress would be bound to notice it. Perhaps he wanted it close at hand. A reminder of some sort. Perhaps Miss Marple's tone suggested she thought nothing of the kind. "Inspector, I wonder if I might trouble you with something I noticed last evening? Just before the toast, I saw Mr. Denham drop something near the punch table. Something that caught the light." "Drop something? What, exactly?" "I couldn't be certain at the time. The light was dim, and I'm afraid my eyesight isn't what it once was, but it had the gleam of gold about it." Inspector Crane's expression sharpened. "Why didn't you mention this last night?" "Because I wasn't certain it was relevant. But now that you've shown me this locket, I think it might be worth examining the area around the punch table rather carefully." The inspector rose immediately. "Constable, fetch Dr. Haddock and meet us in the drawing-room. Miss Marple, if you would be so kind as to show me exactly where you saw this object fall." The drawing-room had been locked since the previous night, with another constable stationed outside. The morning light streaming through the tall windows gave the scene a different character, entirely from the candlelit drama of the night before. The Christmas decorations looked tawdry now, the greenery already browning, the ribbons limp. Miss Marple led the inspector to the area near the sideboard where the champagne had been arranged. Mr. Denham was standing approximately here when I saw something full. He bent to retrieve it, I think. But then Sir Reginald called for the toast, and in the confusion of everyone taking their glasses, I lost sight of him. The inspector dropped to his knees and began a systematic search. Miss Marple, meanwhile, allowed her gaze to travel across the room, reconstructing the positions of the various players in last night's tragedy. "Here," said Inspector Crane suddenly. In his palm lay another locket, identical in size and style to the first, but containing only a single photograph. The face that looked out from the miniature was that of Lady Amelia Harbury, though taken many years ago when she had been young and quite lovely. "Good Lord," breathed the inspector. "What does this mean?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, which she had somehow managed to continue throughout the search. "I rather think it means, Inspector, that love triangles rarely stay in tidy shapes. They tend to overlap in the most unexpected ways. Are you suggesting that Denham was involved with Lady Amelia as well? But she's old enough to be his mother." "Age," said Miss Marple gently, "is no barrier to foolishness, Inspector. Though I suspect the involvement, if such it was, took place rather a long time ago. That photograph looks to have been taken 30 years past, at least." Inspector Crane stared at the locket in his hand. "But this changes everything. If Lady Amelia and Denham had some history together, that would explain Sir Reginald's hostility toward the engagement. A man doesn't want his daughter marrying someone who had an affair with his wife. Assuming that is what happened, we must be careful not to leap to conclusions. But the evidence is suggestive, certainly, but evidence can be arranged. Inspector, someone wanted us to find these lockets. The question is, who and why?" Dr. Haddock entered the room slightly out of breath. "You sent for me, Inspector." "Yes. Tell me, Doctor, you examined the body thoroughly last night. Was there anything in Denham's pockets aside from the usual items?" Dr. Haddock consulted his notes. Handkerchief wallet containing approximately 30 pounds. A railway ticket stub from London to here dated 3 days ago. Some loose change, and the locket you already showed me. Nothing else. You're certain? No papers? No letters? Quite certain. I catalogued everything myself. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Inspector, I wonder if it might be wise to search Mr. Denham's room. If he was carrying one locket on his person, there might be other items of interest in his belongings. I've already conducted a preliminary search, but nothing of significance was found." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple, "the most significant things are those that appear insignificant at first glance. A hotel receipt, perhaps, or a theater ticket. Small things that establish connections and timelines." The inspector regarded her with new respect. "Very well, Doctor. Would you join us, Miss Marple? I should be grateful if you would accompany us as well. Your eye for detail seems remarkably acute." They made their way upstairs to the room that had been assigned to Charles Denham, a comfortable chamber overlooking the front drive. The inspector's men had already searched it, but with Miss Marple's suggestion in mind, they began a more thorough examination. It was Miss Marple who found the hotel receipt tucked into the pages of a book on the bedside table. The Savoy Hotel in London dated 2 weeks prior, charging for a room and dinner for 2. "Dinner for 2, said Inspector Crane. "Any way of knowing who the second person was?" Miss Marple turned the receipt over. On the back, written in a feminine hand, were 3 words, "Until Christmas, darling." The handwriting was bold and distinctive, with elaborate flourishes on the capital letters. "I believe," said Miss Marple quietly, "that we should compare this with samples of handwriting from the ladies of the house. It shouldn't be difficult. Lady Amelia will have written notes and correspondence. Miss Clara Ara and Miss Trent will have as well." Inspector Crane was already moving toward the door. "I'll have them all brought to the library. Each will be asked to write something under the pretext of providing a formal statement." As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was beginning to emerge. 2 lockets, one containing 2 photographs, and one containing only Lady Amelia's portrait. A hotel receipt suggesting a romantic dinner 2 weeks before Christmas. A quarrel overheard between Lady Amelia and Lydia Trent about ruined lives. And somewhere in all of this, a small key that opened something important, and a crushed sprig of mistletoe marked with lipstick. The pieces were there. They simply needed to be arranged in the proper order. Chapter 7. The Letter Behind the Clock. The library had become the nerve center of the investigation, and by mid-morning it was occupied not only by Inspector Crane and his constable, but also by the assembled suspects, each of whom had been asked to provide a written statement of their movements on Christmas Eve. Miss Marple, seated in the corner with her knitting, observed the proceedings with quiet attention. Lady Amelia wrote with swift, decisive strokes, her pen moving across the paper with the confidence of one accustomed to correspondence. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she formed her letters, making her writing uneven and rather childish. Lydia Trent wrote with elaborate flourishes, exactly as one might expect from a young woman who valued style over substance. The handwriting on the hotel receipt, Miss Marple noted, matched none of them precisely, though Lydia's came closest in its decorative quality. Inspector Crane collected the statements and compared them carefully with the receipt, his frown deepening. "Inconclusive," he muttered. "The writing could be disguised, or it might have been written by someone not present in this house. Or," suggested Miss Marple, "it might have been written by someone who wished us to believe it was written by one of these ladies, when, in fact, it was not." The inspector looked at her sharply. "You think it's a deliberate plant?" "I think, Inspector, that this entire affair has been rather carefully stage-managed. The question is, by whom and for what purpose?" Sir Reginald, who had been standing near the fire with barely suppressed agitation, spoke suddenly. "This is intolerable. My house has been turned into a police station. My family subjected to interrogation like common criminals. When will we be permitted to leave? When I'm satisfied I have the truth, Sir Reginald." Inspector Crane's tone was firm. "A man has been murdered under your roof. That takes precedence over comfort." Miss Marple rose from her chair, setting aside her knitting. "Inspector, if I might be excused for a moment, I find I need a brief walk to clear my head. These close rooms can be rather stifling. Of course, Miss Marple, though, I must ask you not to leave the house. Naturally, I thought I might simply visit the library again. I noticed yesterday that it had quite a fine collection of local history, and I do so enjoy browsing." The inspector waved her away, already turning back to his examination of the statements. Miss Marple made her way slowly through the corridors, her eyes taking in every detail. The house was quieter now, the servants going about their duties with subdued efficiency, the Christmas decorations looking increasingly forlorn. She entered the library and closed the door softly behind her. The room was empty, as she'd hoped. The fire had burned down to embers, and the mantel clock that dominated the overmantel had stopped at precisely 11:45, just as she had remembered from her earlier observation. 11:45. 15 minutes before the fatal toast at midnight. Miss Marple approached the clock and studied it carefully. It was an impressive piece, Louis XIV style, if she was not mistaken, with gilt bronze fittings and an enameled face. The pendulum hung motionless behind its glass door. She reached up, her movements careful, despite the slight tremor in her aged hands, and gently tried to move the clock forward. It was heavier than she expected, and for a moment she thought she would need assistance, but then it shifted slightly, revealing a gap between the clock and the wall. Something white caught her eye. Paper wedged into the narrow space. With some difficulty, Miss Marple extracted the paper. It was torn, clearly a fragment of a larger letter, and the handwriting was bold and masculine. Charles Denham's hand, she was certain, matching the style she had seen in the book from his room. The fragment read, "You may silence me tonight, but you cannot hide the past forever. The truth about what happened in '93 will come out, and when it does, the rest was missing, torn away, or perhaps deliberately destroyed." 93, 1893, presumably more than 30 years ago. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Lady Amelia would have been young then, perhaps just married. Sir Reginald would have been establishing himself in business. What could have happened in that year that Charles Denham had threatened to expose? She examined the clock more carefully. Its hands were set at 11:45, and she noticed now that the winding mechanism showed signs of having been deliberately jammed. Someone had stopped this clock at precisely that time, and Miss Marple suspected she knew why, to establish an alibi, perhaps, or to mark the moment when something crucial had occurred, something that led inexorably to the poisoned champagne at midnight. The door behind her opened, and Miss Marple turned to find Lady Amelia standing in the entrance. The older woman's face was pale, her composure visibly strained. "Miss Marple, I thought I might find you here." "Did you, Lady Amelia?" "How perceptive of you." Lady Amelia moved into the room, closing the door behind her. "You're a very observant woman, Miss Marple. I realized that the first time we met at the missionary tea, you see things that others miss. One learns to notice details in a small village. Human nature is much the same everywhere. And what has human nature taught you about this situation?" Miss Marple regarded her hostess thoughtfully. "That fear makes people do desperate things, that the past has a way of returning to haunt us, and that sometimes what appears to be murder is actually self-defense or protection of those we love." Lady Amelia's hands clenched at her sides. "That letter fragment. What does it say?" "I think you know what it says, Lady Amelia. The question is what happened in 1893 that Charles Denham knew about, and why he chose Christmas Eve to threaten exposure." For a long moment, the two women regarded each other in silence. Then Lady Amelia sank into a chair, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "It wasn't about me," she said quietly. "The scandal. I mean, it was about Reginald. Charles had discovered something, some evidence of wrongdoing from years ago. He threatened to take it to the authorities unless she broke off. And unless what? Unless Clara Ara broke off the engagement. He said it was for her own good, that she deserved to know what kind of family she was marrying into. But I think he simply wanted to be free of her without appearing to be the villain." Miss Marple folded the letter fragment carefully. "And so you decided to stop him." Lady Amelia looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Wouldn't you have done the same to protect your family? To prevent a scandal that would destroy everything?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "But I wonder, Lady Amelia, whether you acted alone, or whether someone else had even stronger reasons to want Charles Denham silenced forever." Chapter 8. The Woman in the Green Dress. Lady Amelia's question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Miss Marple, however, was saved from immediate reply by the sound of voices in the corridor outside. Inspector Crane was calling for someone, his tone urgent. "We shall have to continue this conversation later," said Miss Marple quietly. "But I would advise you, Lady Amelia, to tell the inspector the truth. Half-truths and evasions only make matters worse." Lady Amelia rose, drawing herself up with visible effort. "The truth, Miss Marple, is rarely as simple as one might wish." They returned to find Inspector Crane in conversation with Mrs. Treadwell, who had apparently requested an audience. The sharp-featured woman was speaking with considerable animation. "I feel it my duty to report what I observed, Inspector. On Christmas Eve, just before midnight, I saw a woman in a green silk gown leaving the ballroom by the side door. She was moving very quickly, almost ferociously, and she was carrying something in her hand. Can you describe this woman more precisely? She had dark hair, I believe, though the light was dim. The gown was unmistakable, however, a deep green like forest shadows, with rather a daring neckline. Not the sort of thing a respectable woman would wear to a family gathering." Miss Marple observed Lydia Trent, who stood near the window. The young woman's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the window frame. "Miss Trent," said Inspector Crane, "I believe you wore a green gown that evening." "I wore emerald taffeta to the ball," said Lydia, her voice steady despite her pall. "Not silk. But you also own a green silk gown." "I own several green gowns, Inspector. Green is fashionable this season," Mrs. Treadwell interrupted. "The woman I saw was wearing silk." "I'm quite certain of it. The fabric has a particular sheen." Inspector Crane turned to Lady Amelia. "Lady Amelia, what were you wearing on Christmas Eve?" The question clearly surprised her. "I wore gray for dinner, and later changed to a gown of forest green silk for the toast. It seemed appropriate for Christmas." "I see. And did you leave the drawing-room at any point between 11:45 and midnight?" Lady Amelia hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Marple saw the confirmation of what she had already suspected. "I did step out briefly," Lady Amelia said finally. "I needed to compose myself. The events of the previous evening had been most distressing." "Where did you go?" "To the conservatory. It adjoins the drawing-room, and I find the scent of the plants calming. Were you carrying anything?" Another pause. "My handkerchief. Nothing more." Miss Marple, who had been listening carefully, now spoke. "Inspector, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately." They withdrew to the far corner of the room out of earshot of the others. Miss Marple kept her voice low. "I think it would be advisable to examine Lady Amelia's green gown, Inspector, particularly if it has been recently cleaned or laundered. You suspect something specific?" "I suspect that someone who handled poison might have gotten traces of it on their clothing, and I suspect that someone who was aware of this might have attempted to wash it away." Inspector Crane's eyes narrowed. "You think Lady Amelia poisoned Denham?" "I think Lady Amelia put something into his glass. Whether it was poison or merely a sedative is another question entirely." Within the hour, Lady Amelia's green silk gown had been retrieved from her chamber. It hung by the fire in her sitting-room, the fabric still slightly damp, and even from the doorway Miss Marple could detect a faint bitter scent. Almonds, the same scent Elsie had noticed on the small bottle found beneath the chair in the ballroom. Inspector Crane summoned Lady Amelia to her own sitting-room. The woman entered with her head held high, though her face was ashen. "Lady Amelia," said the inspector gravely, "I must ask you directly. Did you put something into Charles Denham's champagne glass?" For a long moment she said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. "I did, but it wasn't poison. I swear to you, Inspector, I never intended to kill him." "Then what did you intend?" Lady Amelia sank into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "To silence him, to stop him from speaking. I had obtained a sedative from Dr. Haddock some months ago when I was having trouble sleeping. A strong dose, he warned me, would cause unconsciousness within minutes. I thought if Charles collapsed before he could make his accusations, if he appeared to be drunk or ill, no one would believe anything he said afterward. So, you administered this sedative when?" "Just before the toast, I positioned myself near the sideboard where the champagne glasses had been arranged. In the confusion of everyone gathering, I slipped the powder into his glass. It dissolved almost instantly. And the bottle? I dropped it near the chairs and kicked it underneath, hoping it would be swept up with the other debris. I hadn't realized the maid would notice the smell." Inspector Crane paced the room. "Why, Lady Amelia? What was Denham threatening to reveal?" Lady Amelia looked at Miss Marple, a plea in her eyes. Miss Marple nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "It was a business matter from 30 years ago. Sir Reginald was involved in a partnership that ended badly. There were accusations of fraud, of misappropriated funds. Another man took the blame and went to prison. He died there, and his family was ruined. Charles had somehow discovered evidence that Reginald was actually responsible, and Denham was going to expose this. He said he would go to the police unless Clara Ara ended the engagement. He claimed he was doing it for her sake, to spare her from being associated with a family built on dishonesty. But I think he simply wanted to be free to pursue Lydia without appearing to be the one who broke faith. So you decided to drug him to prevent this revelation?" "Yes. I thought if he collapsed dramatically, if he appeared to be intoxicated or unwell, any accusations he made afterward would be dismissed as the ravings of a man who couldn't hold his liquor. I never intended his death, Inspector. You must believe me. But he did die, Lady Amelia, and the symptoms Dr. Haddock described are consistent not with a sedative overdose, but with strychnine poisoning." Lady Amelia's eyes widened. "Stricken, but I gave him no such thing. I swear it. The bottle contained only the sleeping powder Dr. Haddock prescribed." Miss Marple, who had been examining the damp gown more closely, now spoke. "Inspector, I think Lady Amelia is telling the truth. The scent on this gown is from bitter almonds, which suggests proic acid, not strychnine, and proic acid might be found in a sedative preparation. But Dr. Haddock said the death was consistent with strychnine. Perhaps, said Miss Marple quietly, because strychnine was also administered by someone else, someone who saw Lady Amelia's actions and seized the opportunity to commit murder while ensuring that suspicion would fall upon her. Inspector Crane stared at her. "You're suggesting two people poisoned Denham's drink. I'm suggesting that Lady Amelia acted first, intending only to incapacitate, but someone else acted afterward, adding a fatal dose of actual poison. The question is, who had both the opportunity and the motive to do so?" Lady Amelia had begun to weep quietly, the tears she had held back finally overwhelming her composure. "I've been such a fool. I thought I was protecting my family, but I've only made everything worse." Miss Marple regarded her with a mixture of sympathy and calculation. Protection of family was one of the oldest motives in the world, but was Lady Amelia the only one who had felt that particular imperative on Christmas Eve? Chapter 9. Confession Before the Fire. The drawing-room at Harbury Hall had become a stage for the final act of the drama. Though not all the players yet knew their roles, Inspector Crane had summoned everyone to gather there as dusk fell on Boxing Day. the gray light filtering through the tall windows, lending an appropriate solemnity to the proceedings. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles moving with steady purpose as she reviewed every detail, every conversation, every small inconsistency that had troubled her from the beginning. The small key from her knitting bag now rested in her palm, hidden within the folds of her wool. The company assembled slowly. Clara Ara sat beside her mother, both women showing the strain of the past 24 hours. Lydia Trent had positioned herself near the fire, her usual vivacity subdued. Colonel Mortimer and Mrs. Treadwell occupied chairs near the door, while Sir Reginald stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the snow that had begun to fall again. Inspector Crane waited until all were settled before speaking. "I have asked you all here because certain facts have come to light that require clarification. Lady Amelia has confessed to administering a sedative to Charles Denham's champagne. However, the poison that killed him was not a sedative. It was strychnine, a far more deadly substance." A collective gasp ran through the room. Clara Ara reached for her mother's hand. "This suggests," continued the inspector, "that two separate attempts were made on Denham's life that evening. One intended merely to silence him temporarily. The other intended to silence him permanently. But who would do such a thing?" Mrs. Treadwell's voice was shrill with excitement, poorly disguised as horror. Miss Marple sat down her knitting and rose from her chair. "Inspector, if I might." Inspector Crane, who had been warned by Dr. Haydog that Miss Marple had a talent for seeing through to the truth, nodded his permission. "Thank you. I've been considering this matter very carefully, and I believe I've arrived at an understanding of what truly happened on Christmas Eve. It is rather complicated, I'm afraid, and it requires us to look not at one relationship, but at several overlapping ones." She moved to the center of the room, a small figure commanding attention despite her age and apparent frailty. "We have been assuming that Charles Denham was the villain of the piece, a young man with no fortune, engaged to one woman while apparently involved with another, carrying lockets with photographs of both. A man who threatened to expose an old scandal unless he was released from an unwanted engagement. But I wonder if we have misunderstood his role entirely." Sir Reginald turned from the window. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Sir Reginald, that Charles Denham was not the blackmailer. He was the investigator. The letter fragment I found behind the clock was not a threat to expose your past crimes. It was a warning that someone else intended to do so." The room fell silent. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The locket containing 2 photographs was placed in his pocket after his death, I believe, to create the impression of a romantic entanglement. The real locket, the one containing only Lady Amelia's photograph, was the one he actually carried, and he dropped it near the punch table because he was trying to show it to someone as evidence." "Evidence of what?" demanded Inspector Crane. "Of the fact that Charles Denham was actually Lady Amelia's son." The shock that greeted this statement was profound. Lady Amelia made a small sound, half gasp, half sob. Clara stared at her mother in disbelief. Miss Marple nodded gently. The scandal of 1893 was not Sir Reginald's business fraud, though that was real enough. It was an illegitimate child born to Lady Amelia before her marriage. The child was given up for adoption, and the matter hushed up. But Charles Denham had discovered the truth, and he came to Harbury Hall not to blackmail anyone, but to meet his birth mother and half-sister. "This is preposterous," said Sir Reginald, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it? The engagement to Clara was a fiction, a way to gain access to the family without revealing the true relationship. I suspect Charles hoped to be accepted once the truth was known, to become part of the family he had never known. But someone in this house could not allow that to happen. Lady Amelia was weeping openly now. It's true. Charles was my son. I was very young, barely 17, and the father was unsuitable. My parents arranged for the child to be taken away and raised elsewhere. I married Reginald 2 years later. He never knew. But I did know, said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Haydock standing there, his medical bag in hand. But it was Sir Reginald who spoke next, his voice heavy with defeat. I discovered the truth 6 months ago when Charles first approached me privately. He had documents, proof of his birth. He wanted my blessing to reveal himself to Amelia and Clara Ara as family. I convinced him to wait, to let me prepare them, but I had no intention of allowing it. Inspector Crane moved forward. Sir Reginald, are you confessing to the murder of Charles Denham? I am. The word seemed to age him years in an instant. Amelia's sedative gave me the opportunity I needed. I saw her slip the powder into his glass. After the champagne was poured and distributed, I found a moment to add my own contribution. Strychnine from the garden shed kept for dealing with rats. I knew the sedative would be found, and Amelia would be blamed. I thought I was protecting my family from scandal, from the revelation that my wife had borne another man's child, that my daughter had been engaged to her own half-brother, even if neither knew the truth. But why? Clara's voice was anguished. If he was my brother, surely we could have found a way to accept him into the family quietly. Because, said Sir Reginald bitterly, Charles had also discovered my business fraud. He promised to remain silent about it if I acknowledged him as family. But I knew once he was established in the household, once he had access to documents and correspondence, he would find more evidence. The fraud was only the beginning. There were other things, other crimes that would have emerged. I couldn't risk it. Miss Marple spoke quietly. So, you murdered your wife's son to protect your own secrets. Fear makes people do desperate things, but desperation rooted in selfishness rather than love is particularly tragic. Inspector Crane signaled to his constable. Sir Reginald Harbury, I am arresting you for the murder of Charles Denham. As the constable moved forward, Sir Reginald looked at his wife and daughter. I did it for us, for our position, our reputation. No, said Lady Amelia, her voice breaking. You did it for yourself. You always have. The constable led Sir Reginald from the room. In the silence that followed, Miss Marple returned to her chair and picked up her knitting once more. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and relentless. Chapter 10. The Scandal Laid to Rest. Dawn broke over Harbury Hall on the morning after Sir Reginald's arrest, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. Miss Marple, who had risen early, as was her custom, found the house possessed of that peculiar quality of exhausted relief that follows the resolution of a great crisis. She made her way to the morning room, where she discovered Clara Ara and Lady Amelia seated together on the sofa, their hands clasped. Both women looked as though they had not slept, but there was a new understanding between them, a shared grief that had somehow created a fragile bridge. Miss Marple, said Lady Amelia, rising, please join us. We were hoping to speak with you. Miss Marple settled herself in a comfortable chair, her knitting bag as always at her side. I'm at your disposal, though I fear there is little I can say that will provide much comfort. You've already provided more than comfort, said Clara Ara quietly. You've provided the truth. Without you, Mother would have been accused of murder, and Father would have escaped justice. It's one of the sadder truths of human nature. The company sat in silence for a moment, each lost in private reflection. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the sun was breaking through the clouds, casting a pale winter light across the grounds. Colonel Mortimer appeared, dressed for departure. "I've arranged for a car to take me home. Can't stay under these circumstances, you understand? But I wanted to say goodbye properly." "You're very kind, Colonel," said Lady Amelia. "I'm sorry your Christmas was so dreadful." "Not your fault, dear lady. Not your fault at all. You were protecting your family as best you knew how. Can't fault a mother for that, even if the method was ill-advised." Mrs. Treadwell followed shortly after, her departure less sympathetic, but equally swift. She would, Miss Marple reflected, dine out on this story for years to come, though doubtless her version would grow more dramatic with each telling. By mid-morning, Miss Marple herself was preparing to leave. Her small bag was packed, and Bridges had arranged for a car to take her to the station. Lady Amelia walked with her to the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything, for seeing the truth, for giving me back my son's memory, unsullied by false accusations. I did only what needed to be done, but I would counsel you, Lady Amelia, to be honest with Clara Ara about everything from now on. Secrets have a way of poisoning families far more effectively than any chemical compound." "I will. We've already begun talking, really talking, for perhaps the first time in years." As Miss Marple's car pulled away from Harbury Hall, she looked back at the great house, its windows reflecting the winter sun, the mistletoe still hanging above the doorway where it had witnessed so much tragedy. She thought of Charles Denham, a young man seeking only to belong, and of Sir Reginald, whose fear of exposure had led him to commit the ultimate crime. She thought of Lady Amelia's desperate attempt to protect her family, and of Clara Ara and Lydia, both now reconciled in their shared grief for a man who had been brother and lover, but who had been above all simply human. "The season of peace," Miss Marple murmured to herself as the car turned through the gates, "often reveals the most restless of hearts." The snow began to fall again, gently covering the footprints that led from the ballroom to the library, from the drawing-room to the conservatory, from the past to the present. By evening, the grounds of Harbury Hall would be smooth and white once more, as though nothing had disturbed their winter tranquility. But those who had lived through the scandal under the mistletoe bough would carry its memory forever, a reminder that even the most festive of seasons could not entirely mask the darkness that resided in desperate, fearful hearts. Miss Marple settled back against the seat cushions and resumed her knitting. There would be other mysteries, other tragedies to untangle. Human nature, she had long ago concluded, was remarkably consistent in its capacity for both nobility and wickedness, and she, in her quiet way, would continue to observe, to understand, and, when necessary, to ensure that truth emerged from beneath the prettiest of decorations and the most elaborate of lies. Days.